Hello and welcome to MacStories Unwind. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is Federico Viticci. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm doing all right. I'm having a great day. It's spring, and spring is in the air. It's warming up, and I'm pretty happy about it.
Hmm.
What do you want to talk
Well,
about today, Viticci? You've got some
well,
questions for me, I see.
I'm happy you're having a good day. I don't think my day is gonna be necessarily like. I don't think it's gonna end on a positive note
Oh
because
no.
I'm going to the condo meeting, and usually
Oh.
those things drag way too long, and people get into arguments, and people get into fights, and
Oh
it's like
yeah.
it's a
Nothing's
whole.
worse than politics at the most local level,
Ah,
basically, right?
yes,
My
yes.
suggestion is to don't care and don't go.
Well, but then they ask me for money to pay,
No, I
and
know. I understand. I do the
it
same thing with my homeowners association here at this
it's
condo.
it's
So,
hard not to care when then the bill comes in. Regardless, I do have some questions for you,
okay.
and it's a question more about your character.
Yeah.
Uh, Something that I've always been curious about. Like, are you a sports person? Have you ever been into sports?
Okay. Those are two very different questions.
Okay, two questions then.
The answer is no and yes, I guess.
Okay.
In that currently no, in the past
Hmm.
yes.
Okay. Do
So
tell.
okay. So I guess I have to rewind very, very far
Oh, so
to
this is Mac Stories Rewind today.
yes,
Okay.
yes. Rewind all the way back to when I was growing up in grade school and high school, where I
Okay.
lived in Michigan in a town called Ann Arbor, which is the
Okay.
home of the University of Michigan, which is one of the bigger colleges in the
Right.
country and a big sports place. And so
Okay.
I grew up going to University of Michigan football games,
Okay.
pretty
What's the
much
name? What's the name of the team?
the Wolverines,
The
which is
Wolverines.
it's a pretty good
Okay.
one, huh?
Okay. Okay.
So I spent the weekends in the fall going to the football games, and
Mm.
I spent the winters going to the basketball games. And that was kind of what the spectator sports that I was into as a kid growing up. That kind of continued because I went to college to Duke here in North Carolina, and Duke is a basketball powerhouse and was
Right.
just becoming a big basketball powerhouse right around the time that I went there. And so I would, sleep out overnight to get into the stadium because it was free for students and the whole lower half of the stadium
Mm.
was reserved for students. But to really get a seat, sometimes a good seat, you'd have to wait in line for hours, if not overnight. So I was very into college basketball for many years.
Okay.
And then
But like, how into were you
oh, like
into
I
it?
knew all the, like I knew all the stats, I knew all the players, I knew all the teams. I watched the games for hours on end.
Okay.
I
Hold
went,
on. Hold on. Hold on. Let me backtrack a second. Were you in high school what they call in the movies and the TV shows a jock?
no, I don't think you could accuse me of being a jock.
Okay.
I
Is that
played a
is
little,
that is that, just a parenthesis? Is that a derogatory term?
no, I mean,
No.
I suppose depends how you use it. I suppose it
Okay.
depends on the context, but yes and no, maybe.
But
But I,
you were not a quarterback or anything like
no,
that.
I played a little soccer, and
Okay.
I was a
Okay.
runner. I was a runner.
Okay.
I did cross country and track, and that was probably
Okay.
about the nerdiest sport you could possibly do. I think,
Mm, mm,
one of the
mm,
nerdier ones.
Okay. So anyway, the basketball. But you were really
So I
into
was very into
basketball.
that, and then
Okay.
later in life, one of my oldest son was played hockey for like a decade.
Oh, I remember that.
All
Okay.
right. And yeah, that included a little bit of the time when you and I knew each other. And I spent a lot of time hanging out at hockey rinks since you couldn't help but get into professional hockey that way. So I was and Chicago had a very good team at the time. So I
Mm,
followed the Chicago Blackhawks
okay.
and
Cool name.
went to a lot of games, and yeah, that was my thing for a while. But maybe some people would consider it sad, but it's been kind of beaten out of me by I just don't have time for it anymore. I mean,
Mm,
it's part of it had to do with changing careers, my kids growing up, not having their involvement in sports being
mm,
kind of a catalyst to that anymore. having different interests, moving on to different things. I don't know. It just kind of became something that I wasn't into anymore. So I don't and I suppose another part of it is that coincided, that like transition in my life, I guess, coincided with the time when we finally dropped cable and started streaming, and I didn't care that much about sports anymore. And now I really don't even have access to sports hardly at all.
Oh, so you don't watch the Super Bowl, for example?
I did watch the Super Bowl.
Okay.
And probably more so because Jennifer wanted to watch the Super Bowl. She likes to watch the ads, all the notorious ads.
To be fair, this is my hot take for today. To be fair, the ads are more interesting than the game.
Yeah, it was not a very good game this year. And it happened that this year my brother-in-law was in town, and he's a big football fan, so he wanted to watch it. So, we had like a little Super Bowl party with him because he was in town, and we watched the game, and it was fun. I mean, that and one other game that I watched with him when he was visiting us about a month before that were the only two football games I watched all year. And I do have the ability to do that, particularly over the air. I do have an over the air antenna that I can use that you know about because you've watched TV with that antenna before.
Yes.
And so that's how I watch the Super Bowl, because actually over the air, the picture quality is oftentimes better than it is streaming because they don't, it's not nearly as compressed. So I was getting like nice 4K signal for the football game.
Nice. Did I ever tell you that like when I was little, I was really into football?
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, I was really into football. I played football for a while when I was...
I think you've told me that, yeah.
Very little. I was a goalkeeper.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Well, you're tall. Well, you weren't tall when you were little, though, were you?
I wasn't tall, but I think what worked for me was that I've always been very focused as a person. So I would be very focused on the game, and people who were like trying to attack and score. And sure. I think that the thing that worked for me, and when I was like 10 or 12, I was not tall, but I was unafraid of getting hurt. I would just jump.
Okay, interesting.
I would just jump, tackle, go for it. I wouldn't care. When I was little, I would basically massacre my knees, and I just didn't care. Yeah, I was totally unafraid of potential damage.
Yeah,
which is obviously something that changed with age, but
sure.
but then I stopped because I was much more, obviously, much more into studying for school and video games. So that sports career was very short lived.
Yeah, my sports career kind of ended in college when I was actually running for Duke, and it was a Division I school, so they had some pretty good runners. And we used to go out on these incredibly long runs out in the forests of North Carolina. And I left it all out on these trails. Like I would come back and I would be so tired that I couldn't study. I would eat more food than the football team. Like we'd sit in these cafeterias with the football team, and the runners would out eat the football players because we were burning so many calories out running all the time. And just became too much, and I burned out. And that's when I hung it up. And I think the problem though of having had that in my past is now, if I go out for a jog, I still kind of somewhere in the back of my head think I'm that, like 20-year-old guy out running on the trails and think I can do things that my body just can't handle anymore.
It doesn't work like that anymore.
No, it doesn't work like that anymore. It's a long time ago.
This is an interesting side of you. I'm glad I brought it up on the show.
Yeah, I'm glad you did too. You and I don't think you and I have ever really talked about that before.
We never talked about sports because we're
neither
not
one of us are that into it at this point in our lives. I don't think.
We're not that into it right now anymore. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
I have a pick for today's show, and it's an unusual pick for me. It's a book, which is not unusual, but I am listening to this book.
Oh, interesting.
I think for the first time in my life, I'm listening to an audiobook, and I gotta tell you, I am surprisingly into it because it's basically like listening to a podcast, which is something that I guess I should have figured out earlier in life. But
you've never really been an audiobook person, huh? Interesting.
First time, absolutely the first time. I'm using Audible, which syncs back thanks to WhisperSync. It syncs back your progress to the Kindle app, so you can sort of jump back and forth between listening and reading, and it keeps your position. But I'm mostly listening. And it's this book by this professor, Ethan Mollick. The book is called Co-Intelligence. It's It's a productivity slash business slash finance book about artificial intelligence and the idea of how to coexist with artificial intelligence these days. Ethan Mollick is a professor at the Wharton School of University of Pennsylvania, specializing in innovation, entrepreneurship, that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And Ethan Mollick also runs an excellent newsletter that I think it's called One Small Thing, something like that. A really, really good newsletter about like the tech industry and keeping up with AI. And it's basically this book that tries to explain, and it goes through multiple stages of like, first of all, it was written at the end of 2023. So keep that in mind. Like the author refers to GPT-4 as the latest model, which is obviously not the latest model anymore. But the author is very like the author makes predictions of the things we were supposed to see in 2024 and 2025 that were absolutely spot on. Predicted the rise of agents and the rise of bigger models. Like all the predictions from a year and a half ago are absolutely spot on. But what I think is interesting about the book is trying to find a framework for accepting the reasons why AI can be terrible, and the author doesn't mince any words in that regard, but also how, if this thing now exists and will exist for the foreseeable future, how can we use it as a tool, as an instrument to help humans, which is pretty much exactly what we discussed in an episode of App Stories a few weeks ago.
Right.
So I saw that book recommended by someone online.
Matt Birchler did, I think. You probably saw it on Matt's.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't Matt. I didn't know that Matt.
Matt
Nice.
did recommend it to his membership, and that's where I found out about it and bought it.
Nice.
I actually bought the paper version of the book at a local bookstore.
Nice. I had no idea. It was someone else. And it was basically like this book about like, okay, this thing exists. It can be terrible. It is terrible. Are there useful parts? And how can we leverage the useful parts? I think it's an interesting book. And it's not exactly like drastically changing my mindset. If anything, because I'm already quite aligned with the author's point of view. So I recommend it. And I'm listening to it as an audiobook, which is fine. Obviously, 1.6x speed.
Of course you are.
Of course.
You are like, straight into the brain, right?
Yep.
Well, yeah, audiobooks to me, they're great. I've been listening to audiobooks for years, kind of on and off, not like consistently, but maybe that's an American thing in that, when we travel, a lot of times if you go on a car trip, it's a very long way. So we would often listen to audiobooks on long car trips in the summertime, whether it was cassette tapes or CDs back in the day, or now, on your phone. And when I took my son up to Philadelphia recently, I listened to a novel on the way up there and back. I try to pick them out so they'll match the drive time for those long trips. I think that's a great recommendation. I really like Co-Intelligence. I'm not very far into it myself, but it does seem like a really nice take on it in kind of a broad and cultural sense, which I think is important, an important thing to consider in kind of where we are with AI in the world. So for I have a pick and a question for listeners for this week. And my pick is the Channels podcast with Peter Kafka. This is produced by Vox Media, and Kafka is a journalist who's been around for a long time. This show has been around for a long time. It was on hiatus for a while, I believe. I started picking it up again recently. What I like about it is I think he's a good interviewer. It has a lot of interesting guests, and it's very often tech and media adjacent. So there's an aspect of, cultural impact of technology, political and economic impact of technology, all kind of baked into here in a way that I enjoy, because it's a different angle on the kinds of things that we cover, but we don't cover them in this kind of more broad sense a lot of times than someone like he does. And, there are a couple of examples of recent interviews. There was one by the guy who wrote the Big Short, Michael Lewis, which was kind of interesting. I was listening this morning actually to an author who wrote a book about the U.S. versus Sullivan, which is a very famous First Amendment free speech decision by the U.S. Supreme Court, and how there are forces in the legal communities in the U.S. that are aligned with trying to overturn that and make it easier to sue not just media companies and journalists for what they write about people, but also just individuals, which is a very big change, because historically the First Amendment case, Sullivan, U.S. versus Sullivan, that's something that both liberals and conservatives got behind in the U.S. So that's kind of an interesting sea change in the U.S. right now. So it's that kind of stuff. There's definitely some political overtones to it, but a lot of times it's also cultural, and there's a big dose of media too, which I like. The question I have for listeners is, I need a recommendation for a TV show. I've been thinking about 2 shows, and I want to hear from anybody on social media whether they've watched these or not. One is Day of the Jackal, which is on Peacock. Now, Day of the Jackal, it's an adaptation of a book that was written back in the 70s, I think, kind of a political thriller action type of show. And I haven't watched it yet, haven't started it. That's one that I'm considering. And the other one is called Apple Cider Vinegar, which is on Netflix, which, as I understand it, is a comedy about influencers, which I don't know. I'm a little obsessed with influencer culture in kind of a watching a train wreck type of way. I find it fascinating just to see what's going on. And I recently recommended a documentary that I watched on Max about influencer culture, which was a true story, but this is a drama. And I thought, I'm curious if anybody's watched either of these and whether they'd recommend them. So love to hear from people about that.
Okay.
All right, Federico, I think that's it for this week. Thanks again for listening to the show or watching it on YouTube. And if you haven't checked it out on YouTube, maybe give it a try. It's on the MacStories channel, so you'll find a link in the show notes to that. Of course, you can find us at MacStories.net, writing away, and we're on Club MacStories, and of course, social media, where Federico is at Viticci, that's VITICCI, and I'm at John Voorhees, JOHNVOORHEES. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.